Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Concert Insights, Schubert Club's new online version of the traditional pre-concert talk. My name is Mark Bilyeu, and I'm thrilled to join you for the third concert of the 2023-24 International Artist Series. This time, the Icelandic pianist Víkingur Ólafsson offers Bach's pinnacle keyboard work, the Goldberg Variations. Keyboard is the key word here, not piano. The piano, with its hammered strings and single keyboard, was just a twinkle in the eyes of instrument makers when Bach crafted this work in 1741. Instead, the harpsichord, with its plucked strings and two separate keyboards, reigned supreme. And it was the harpsichord at which the virtuoso Johann Goldberg excelled. Actually, he was also really good at playing the organ and composing, which is why, at the age of 10, he was hired as the musician to the Russian ambassador to Saxony, Germany, a guy named Hermann Karl von Kayserling. Now, the ambassador was an insomniac, and according to Bach's first biographer, a man named Johann Nikolaus Forkel, who was most certainly a Bach acolyte, the Goldberg Variations are directly related to this nobleman's sleeplessness. Forkel wrote, "For this work, we have to thank the instigation of the former Russian ambassador to the electoral court of Saxony, Count Kayserling, who often stopped in Leipzig and brought there with him the aforementioned Goldberg, in order to have him given musical instruction by Bach. The Count was often ill and had sleepless nights. At such times, Goldberg, who lived in his house, had to spend the nights in an antechamber so as to play for him during his insomnia. Once the Count mentioned in Bach's presence that he would like to have some clavier pieces for Goldberg, which should be of such a smooth and somewhat lively character that he might be a little cheered up by them in his sleepless nights. Bach thought himself best able to fulfill this wish by means of variations, the writing of which he had until then considered an ungrateful task on account of the repeatedly similar harmonic foundation. But since at this time all his works were already models of art, such also these variations became under his hand. Yet he produced only a single work of this kind. Thereafter, the Count always called them his variations. He never tired of them, and for a long time, sleepless nights meant, "Dear Goldberg, do play me one of my variations." Bach was perhaps never so rewarded for one of his works as for this. The Count presented him with a golden goblet filled with 100 louis d'or. Nevertheless, even had the gift been 1,000 times larger, their artistic value would not have been paid for. Some quick back-of-the-napkin math tells me that the gift in the goblet would have been equivalent to over $100,000 in the US today. So now it's important to remember that, although this story is really compelling, Forkel's account, written 60 years after this event, is the only one we have of this origin story. So scholars can't fully corroborate it. We do know that the timeline checks out, so I am personally choosing to believe it. Forkel's account has a few additional morsels for us. First, while these variations are the only set of variations that Bach wrote, he was not a stranger to elaborating on a repeated ground bass. His famous D minor chaconne was written 20 years earlier. Hopefully, you got to hear the guitarist Milos play his guitar transcription of that work earlier this season. This is, however, the only set of variations that Bach wrote. The second morsel to pull out from Forkel is that Kayserling asked for a work that would cheer him up in his sleepless nights, not put him to sleep. This story gets told often. Check any program note for the Goldberg Variations. But too often, people distill it down to some sort of audible sleeping pill. I love this quote from pianist Glen Gould, whose career is synonymous with the Goldberg Variations. He said, "If this work functioned well as sleeping pills or a lullaby, it was very doubtful that Maestro Goldberg played sincerely at this work, which had an agitating context and a bitter taste. We'll talk about Glen Gould in just a bit. Lastly, it's interesting to note that although Kayserling referred to the work as his variations and paid handsomely for them, Bach did not directly dedicate the work to him. In fact, the work ended up being Goldberg's name. The lack of dedication is surprising, not only for the money the ambassador paid, but also because these variations were some of the few works of Bach's that were actually published during his lifetime, and he certainly could have included a dedication. Here we see the original front page, which translated read, "Keyboard exercise consisting of an aria with diverse variations for harpsichord with 2 manuals, composed for connoisseurs for the refreshment of their spirits, by Johann Sebastian Bach, composer for the Royal Court of Poland and the Electoral Court of Saxony, Kapellmeister and director of choral music in Leipzig, Nuremberg, Balthasar Schmidt, publisher." It's good to point out at this time that Bach identified which variations were to utilize 2 keyboards and which could be played with 1. It's also a good time to remember that a piano only has 1 keyboard, and to ask you to give yourself permission to be stunned by the acrobatics and athleticism required of pianists who tackle this work. The hand crossing is legendary. The theme, Bach's aria, is a saraband. This Baroque dance had its origins in the cult of Dionysus, which was a much more rhythmic and bawdy dance, and which was actually banned by the Spanish government in 1583. In the 17th century, it had migrated to Italy and France, where it became a slow, courtly dance, always in 3/4 time. Like many composers of the Renaissance and Baroque eras, Bach incorporated these courtly dances into dance suites. But Bach also gave the saraband prominence, utilizing it as the aria theme here in the Goldberg Variations, and also using it as the final movements of both the St. John and the St. Matthew Passions. With 30 variations, you might assume that even Bach would migrate pretty far afield from the original statement. 30 variations are a lot of variations. Yet Bach crafted a scaffolding for this work that is radically systematic and yet shockingly fresh to the listener. Every third variation in this series of 30 is a canon, a technique similar to a round, but which imitates rather than replicates the original melody. These canons follow an ascending pattern. Variation 3 is a canon at the unison. That is, the second voice begins on the exact same note. The second canon, Variation 6, has the second voice enter a whole step, or a second, above the first voice. And the pattern continues with every third variation until we reach Variation 9, which is a canon at the 9th. Now, there are more patterns to be found within the Goldberg Variations, and trust me, people have built careers looking for, hypothesizing over, and arguing about these patterns. But it's best to not get bogged down in the work's incredible minutiae when you're experiencing a live performance of it. I do want to draw your attention to a few specific variations that you'll be able to hang your hat on. Variation 16, smack dab at the halfway point, is labeled Overture, which most of us know is that piece of music that saves us from not missing any singing when we're running late to the opera. Here, Bach crafts a variation in the French overture style, which is to say the first half of the variation is a stately dotted opening, and the second half is a faster fugal section. After this overture, be on the lookout for Variation 25, what harpsichordist Wanda Landowska called the Black Pearl. Clocking in at nearly 10 minutes, it is the longest variation by nearly a factor of 2, and one of the only 3 movements in a minor key. The final variation, Variation 30, is a quodlibet. Instead of being the expected canon at the 10th, aside from being one of the more fun musical terms to say out loud, a quodlibet is a compositional technique where a composer takes well-known melodies and overlays them in counterpoint, sort of like a modern-day mashup. They are often humorous, Glen Gould improvised a quodlibet with the Star-Spangled Banner and God Save the King, which he claimed to have created while in the bathtub. But in Bach's time, the practice was seen as the pinnacle of counterpoint mastery, with maybe a little humor thrown in. Here, in the final variation, Bach utilizes two well-known German folk tunes, which he lays over the original aria's harmonic structure. The first tune we hear translates to, "I have so long been away from you. Come closer, come closer." And in the second bar, Bach overlays the folk song, "Cabbage and turnips have driven me away. Had my mother cooked meat, I'd have opted to stay." So it's pretty clear that this final variation is a bit of a joke, and we know that the Bach family loved a good quodlibet. Back to Forkel, Bach's first biographer, who wrote about the Bach family reunions. He said, "As soon as they were assembled, a chorale was first struck up. From this devout beginning, they proceeded to jokes, which were frequently in strong contrast. That is, they then sang popular songs, partly of comic and also partly of indecent content, all mixed together on the spur of the moment. This kind of improvised harmonizing they called a quodlibet, and not only could laugh over it quite wholeheartedly themselves, but also aroused just as hearty and irresistible laughter in all who heard them. My family just plays Uno when we get together." This recital with Víkingur Ólafsson aligns with his newest release on the Deutsche Grammophon label, which I can't recommend enough. Recordings of the Goldberg Variations have a life and a following and a Wikipedia page all their own. In 1933, the Polish harpsichordist Wanda Landowska, you will remember she is the one who dubbed Variation 25 the Black Pearl, was the first artist to make an audio recording of the work, which until then was an esoteric, obscure work unknown to anyone outside of academic circles. In 1955, a young Canadian pianist named Glen Gould rocketed into the spotlight with his no-repeats, lightning-fast recording of the work, which catapulted him into the international spotlight. As we said, his name became synonymous with Goldberg, and it gave Bach played on a piano a new life. 25 years later, and a year before his death, Gould would re-record the work, saying, "I can no longer recognize the person who did that first recording. To me, today, that piece has intensity without any sort of false glamour. Not a pianistic or instrumental intensity, a spiritual intensity." No false glamour here. We are in for a treat as we experience Víkingur Ólafsson's offering of Bach's Goldberg Variations here at the Schubert Club. We'll see you next time.